the opportunity to talk about the findings of that workshop through the report with Lori Geller, and then several other participants, panelists, Elizabeth Larry from the USDA Forest Service, Diane Pataki from the University of Utah, and Gary Allen from the Center of the Chesapeake Communities, as well as a couple of other SUF Sustainable Urban Forest Coalition leaders, Scott Macko from Davie, who also chairs our research group, as well as Jerry Gray, who co-chairs along with Rebecca Turner, our policy working group. And so at the very end of our session, which will run about a half an hour, we'll open the lines via email and chat feature for you to send in questions, and we will do our best to address those questions by the panelists and other SUFC members. So we have right about an hour today. So again, making sure you're in the right place at the right time. If this is not the webinar you signed up for, feel free to ring off, but we're really glad you're here today. And we will also be, Sarah will probably come back in on the end, and we will be recording and posting this webinar as well. So let me jump right in and tell you a little bit more about Lori Geller. She's the Senior Program Officer at the National Academies of Science here in Washington, D.C. The Academies of Science, for those who are not familiar with it, it's a nonprofit society of scholars who are dedicated to furthering research, science, and technology for the betterment of our society. Lori has her PhD from the University of Colorado, and in her spare time, she's also a citizen forester with Casey Trees here in the District of DC. So she's got her both her street cred and her academic cred. She directs many National Academies of Sciences study ranging from air pollution to climate change, sustainable development. She developed and oversaw this particular ecosystems workshop and was key in pulling together the very disparate information into the report. She long ago spent down the Forest Service grants that helped fund this work, and so she's running on fumes for us, but that just further underscores her urban forestry passion. So Lori, I really appreciate you spending all the time, and this is your second time, walking us through the report and the findings, and so thank you very much for being here today, and I'm going to hand it over to you. Lori, we'll give Lori a minute to make sure her line is open. And I see that the correct slides are up. Sarah, are you able to make sure that Lori's lines are open?
I am. Lori, it looks like you have the keyboard and mouse controls. I want to make sure that that we're able to hear you. I'm just going to make sure you're on the line.
Thanks everybody for holding with us.
Laura, you want to go ahead and make sure that you are unmuted.
I have her unmuted from my end, Sarah.
Okay. Apologize for the technical difficulties.
Lori, can you shoot me a chat and tell me what's going on from your end so we can get a sense of what's happening? And she's not sure why this is happening either. Of course, it was working when we hit live, when we hit go.
We're just going to have Lori call right back in, and she should be with us shortly.
Thank you. Great. All right. So this is where the free form part comes in. Lori is very key to our presentation today, but I will go ahead and give you a quick overview of Beth Larry, Diane Pataki, and Gary Allen, who are also going to be speaking later today. They're following Lori while we're waiting for Lori to come in. So Beth Larry, who many of you know, is the National Program Lead of Urban Research at USDA Forest Service. She's here in the Washington, D.C. and Baltimore area. She has 10 years plus, or 10 years and working with the Department of Ag. She has her master's from Yale in Forestry. She is also a Doris Duke and a Presidential Management Fellow. And all points of urban research eventually lead back to Beth at the Forest Service. So Beth is someone we rely on heavily to keep us informed and to make sure that all the parties are talking and to be able to kind of find out what the state of being is with urban forestry and research for the coalition. And Beth will be able to talk about the Forest Service role and with this workshop, and also clarify that the Forest Service was not guiding this, but we're funding the work, which is very important to the independence of this particular study. And I will also talk about Diane too. Sarah, are we still waiting for
So it looks like
Lori to get back online?
Yeah, this is Lori. Can you hear me now?
Yes, wonderful.
Ah, okay, great. I think we're making progress here.
Okay, great. Well, I was just filling time, Lori, and I was actually just introducing the other presenters, but let me hand it back over to you. So we're great on time. So I believe the first slide is up, and are you ready to roll?
Yeah. So let's give this a try. I'm just going to real quickly test the slide control, see if I can actually click forward. Okay, yes, does seem to be working. Great. Okay, well, yeah, apologies for the glitches there. I've done a lot of webinars from my end, and there's always one or another problems that come up, but I think we're good to go. So, yeah, I did want to give a sincere thanks to Jen and Sarah for organizing and hosting this forum. And like they explained, my role here, I think, is really just to provide a short overview of what took place at the workshop that we hosted almost exactly a year ago. And I will be jumping through the slides rather quickly, but I think the slides will be made available online later. So if I'm glossing over some of the details too quickly, you can always go back and look at them later. So just to start real quickly, for those who are not familiar with our institution, as was alluded to earlier, National Academy of Sciences is a non-governmental organization that serves as sort of a key independent advisor to government on matters of science and technology. So really the main mechanisms of how we work are either through consensus studies, where you have a committee goes through a long process of sort of weighing evidence on a subject and then writing a report with sort of their official conclusions or recommendations. Or we host a variety of workshop or symposia, where the goal is really just to provide a platform for bringing together a wide variety of experts and stakeholders on a topic to debate. And so really the event that we held on urban forestry was in the latter category. It was a workshop. And so we do have a nice published report that summarizes pretty much all of the information and ideas that came up in the workshop. And at the end, it can give you a website on where you can obtain that report. But we didn't, in this activity, try to distill all those ideas down into kind of a nice compact list of findings. So that's kind of the limitations to give you up front. So let me just give it a few words about sort of our motivation for pursuing this topic. So I'm sure most anyone who is on this call is familiar with the growing enthusiasm that's been building over, well for more than a decade now, in support of green infrastructure as sort of a key strategy for mitigating the harmful environmental effects of urbanization. And it's really partly stemming from that enthusiasm, I think, that a lot of major cities around the U.S. have been declaring these ambitious goals for expanding their tree canopy. And often, a selling point for those tree canopy campaigns is the idea that urban trees are not just beautiful to look at, but also that they provide us with this wide array of important ecosystem services or environmental benefits. And over time, that argument has evolved from being just sort of a qualitative type discussion to a much more precise quantitative one, where we are using modeling studies to say that, say, for every 100 trees that are planted, that you reduce X pounds of air pollution in the air, that you are soaking up X pounds of water pollution, or that you're sequestering X pounds of carbon dioxide, and then perhaps even estimates that you're saving some amount in healthcare costs of the local population. And I think in some cities and regions, we've been seeing this line of argument evolving to the point that it's the basis for trying to receive regulatory credit for using tree planting programs as an official mitigation measure in air and water pollution control with EPA. And really, once you've entered that territory, you've sort of raised the bar in terms of the scientific accuracy of the information that you need to gather and provide. And so that is, I think, where it really caught our interest as an important area of scientific inquiry, and an area where we'd really like to get a better handle on, how well do we have these sorts of ecosystem service estimates nailed down, and what is the science underlying those estimates? So with that in mind, we proposed a NAS workshop to explore these sorts of questions and ask, what are our current scientific capabilities to quantify or to characterize these different ecosystem services, and what are some of the key gaps or weaknesses in our understanding at present, and then what sorts of research is most needed in order to advance this knowledge and these capabilities. So fortunately, we found a great advocate for this effort within the U.S. Forest Service, Beth Larry, who we'll be hearing from later, who really helped to provide funding support and to make this happen. So the workshop was designed to focus primarily on these types of ecosystem services listed here. So really just looking at the biophysical services, including mitigation of air pollution, buffering of waterways from pollution and from stormwater overflow, efforts to reduce urban heat island effects, and efforts to sequester carbon, and then habitat for wildlife. And we did also try to explicitly consider a variety of potential disservices of expanding tree canopy, such as the ones listed here. And I imagine this group on the call here, is familiar with the wide array of very important potential benefits of expanding green space that fall into the realm of, mental health or social community well-being. And we did not actually try to design the workshop to explicitly address those sorts of issues, in part because they're so much harder to quantify. But they did actually end up coming up a lot in the workshop discussions anyway, just because there's such great interest to our audience, and there is a lot of really intriguing research being done in those areas. So I just want to acknowledge the volunteer committee that did most of the actual intellectual heavy lifting in planning the workshop, and that group was chaired by Gary Allen, who's with us today and who's did a great job of leading us through that process. And this also shows the excellent group of people who we had serving as speakers for the workshop. And I'll note that included Diane Pataki, who gave a really thought-provoking presentation at the workshop, and so who I was very happy to see is on this call. And that's part of why I'm going quickly, because I'm really anxious and curious to hear what Diane has to say. And then this next slide just gives you a sense of the affiliation of the different workshop participants. We had over 100 people total, and I think that group could have been much larger, but we were just limited by the meeting room constraints. But who we had there was really a great mix of people from lots of different federal agencies and from a variety of state and local or county agencies, and then from many different academic institutions and many different types of NGOs and foundations, and even a few from the private sector. So it was people coming both from many different disciplines and also different types of stakeholder perspectives. So I think that's part of what made for such rich discussions. All right, and this just kind of gives you a quick overview of the agenda from the workshop. So it was partly just presentations from the experts who were listed in my earlier slide, but we did also spend a lot of time in breakout groups where everybody got to throw their ideas into the ring. And in those breakout groups, we were explicitly asking people to share their ideas on, first, what do they see as the key remaining kind of challenges to advancing our understanding of these different types of ecosystem services from tree planting, and then what specific kind of steps are needed to help address those challenges. And so the next few slides are really just meant to give some examples or a sampling of what sorts of ideas arose in these breakout group discussions. And the official summary report from the workshop gives you an exhaustive list of all the ideas that came up. I certainly won't go through all of those here, and I won't even try to read all of the slides, but just to kind of give you a sense of some of the main themes that emerged. So people, had a lot to say about the need for research related to designing planting strategies that can maximize certain types of ecosystem benefits, or even more importantly, strategies that could optimize multiple benefits simultaneously. People suggested a lot of research needs related to best practices for ensuring tree survival and good maintenance practices. We had a lot of ideas that came from social science research related to how we need to improve our understanding of just public attitudes and behavior towards stewardship of trees. And then also a lot of good specific suggestions regarding the types of tools and databases that need to be advanced. And then finally we had some suggestions regarding the types of knowledge we need specifically in order to meet certain regulatory requirements for those air and water quality control programs in particular. And then finally, there were kind of a slew of ideas related to just better understanding how to improve public engagement and communication in order to make a thriving urban forestry program. So again, apologies for kind of flying through those, but just to, hope it gives you a sense of the kind of ideas that we were discussing there at the workshop. And then, like I said, unfortunately, we do have kind of the limitation that the activity was not just designed to kind of distill all of that down into its just official recommendations. But again, you're encouraged to look at the workshop report to get a full sense of all the ideas that came up. And for what it's worth, I thought I'd just kind of lay out what to me seemed like some key messages that leapt out from the activity. So first is just this idea that clearly we've made a lot of progress in the past decade or so in studying many of these different types of ecological benefits. But the understanding of key mechanisms on some of the topics is still pretty incomplete, and in many cases there's a pretty limited base of studies to look to, so it's hard to draw simple generalizations. We found that for so many of these ecosystem services, the actual kind of quantitative benefit that emerges is very dependent on context. It depends on the type of tree, on the ecological setting, and many different factors. So just simple generalizations are hard to come by. And just this general idea emerges that more and more, I think, urban tree planting is going to will need to be guided by more than just the personal values that probably we all share, that more green is better, that we really do need to develop the sort of sophisticated understanding of what will yield the greatest benefits. I think by far the best term that I learned at the workshop was this idea of hyper-functional landscapes, and it's which I'm sure many of you know of. But basically, we have such limited space in many cases to actually expand the green space within urban areas. So we need to design those to address as many ecosystem services as possible. And then some of the areas that really seem to emerge, where we need progress is just agreeing on some of the basic definitions to start with, and to make sure that there's use of consistent methodologies for measuring impacts, because there may be lots of studies done in different places around the country, but if they're not sharing kind of the same metrics and methodologies, it's hard to compare them. And consideration of some of the unintended effects, for instance, the impacts on local water supplies if you're trying to expand tree canopy in the water-stressed areas. And then clearly, the need to move beyond just single disciplinary focused areas and try to do more of this systems level thinking. So let's see if I'm not sure if I'm still able to advance the slides here. Sarah, I might need to hand it back to you because seems like I can't move it forward now. So if you want to take back the control and just step it forward, that would be fine. Okay, that works. Thanks. So just to kind of wrap up here, I think we realized from the beginning that we were wrestling with this sort of multi-layered set of issues on this topic. And the peeling the onion analogy was what always came to mind for me. So you could focus really at the broadest level at just these questions of urban sustainability, and there are a huge array of issues and strategies to look at that level. Or you could focus more specifically on green infrastructure as just one of the important strategies of sustainable development. Or you could focus within that even more specifically on tree planting as one key element within green infrastructure. But then finally, within just that circle of urban forestry, you have each of these different ecosystem services to look at. And I think we could have easily done a full 2-day conference just looking at the science taking place within any one of those blue circles. I mean, for instance, a conference to really dig in on better understanding the science of how trees interact with air pollution, because there's still a lot of complexity that needs to be better understood in that arena. So I think at the workshop we held last year, we sort of ended up leaping around among these different levels. And so it certainly made for a really interesting and dynamic sort of discussion. But, I think we realized that we were just scratching the surface of a lot of these important topics. So personally, I would love to see some more follow-up activities to really explore any of these different layers. But it probably would be wise to kind of decide up front, what layer you're trying to get at the problem, so you know what level of detail to focus at. And then if you could just move forward to my last slide. Okay, great. So yeah, just let you know. Actually, this is not the one that has my the address. I was to let you know where you can get a free download of the report. It's www.nap.edu. That's National Academy Press. So if you just go there and type in urban forestry, then I think the report should come up. And if any of you are interested to weigh in with thoughts or ideas about the next steps that my institution could take to play a useful role in this arena, I would love to hear your thoughts. So please feel free to contact me. So with that, I think I'll hand it off to some of our other speakers. And
Good. Thank you very much, Lori. I appreciate that. I know it's a lot to cover, and you wove through it quickly but eloquently, and even managed our technical glitches. It's amazing that we still have this many with webinars, and they're all across the service providers. So thank you for doing that. And I'm going to just I'll reintroduce Beth Larry quickly. I gave her bio before, but as I mentioned, Beth and as Lori mentioned, was key in having this workshop happen and helping to arrange the funding for that from the Forest Service. And Beth, are you on the line now? And I'll also give a quick disclaimer that Beth was struggling with a cough, so hopefully she'll be able to make it through, and she's going to speak for about 5 or so minutes, give us some context. And so Beth, when you're able to chime in, just do so. And if you're not, maybe we have the same issue that we had with Lori, and we might need to call back. Sarah,
okay, I think that I'm on. Can you hear me?
You are. Fantastic.
Good.
That was almost seamless. So handing it off to you.
Well, my coughing will not make this seamless, unfortunately, but I've just downed some tea, so hopefully I'll get through it. And thanks, Jen and Sarah, for putting this on. This is fantastic. And it's actually just so great to have this time to reflect on the workshop. It was a year ago that the workshop took place. It's been almost 3 years since Lori and I first met and realized that we had a strong appetite for what we started calling a state of the science activity on urban ecosystem services. From the Forest Service's perspective, we knew that there was a great body of literature and ongoing research activity on ecosystem services and the urban environment. The Forest Service, of course, has been a big contributor. Yet, as natural resource managers, we haven't become more sophisticated over time, I think, in the way that we describe the benefits of trees in an urban setting. We generalize to say that trees are great, and we list the many benefits that trees provide. But as research managers, we don't, and we really can't go much further than that. As Lori mentioned, the enthusiasm and the demand for green infrastructure performance is huge. Municipalities want to know how to measure or quantify the benefits of a particular environmental action in a specific place. They're wondering if the action and how to describe the reaction resulting in a real, measurable, verifiable unit of improvement. They want to know how we can monitor it for environmental performance, how we can justify investments in urban forestry and green versus built infrastructure, and how we can provide assurances to the community that Action A is better than Action B in pursuing a sustainability goal. So we embarked on this effort to put the workshop together with much of this in mind. As sponsor, the Forest Service helped to shape the purpose and initial concept, but I was not allowed to be part of the planning process. And as Lori described, our aim was to have a better understanding of what we know when it comes to urban ecosystem services, with what level of certainty, and what we don't know. We also very deliberately wanted to bring scientists together on this topic across biophysical and social science disciplines in the spirit of fostering communication across specific areas of urban ecosystem services research. I get the fun task, I believe, on this panel of doing a little bit of reflection. So I'm going to do that and throw out some observations and then talk a little bit about the direction we might want to take a year later. So first, some observations. The scientist presentations and the breakout comments confirmed what we felt going in, that the state of the science is unclear and that there are a ton of outstanding questions, as you can see if you look at Appendix A in the report, and Lori put a lot of those questions and comments up on the screen just now. We didn't leave with a comprehensive review of the science and knowledge gaps, but we're now, I really think, a step further in consolidating some of the thinking. And I don't think this should be overlooked. I think this is really helpful. If you can't read the entire report, make sure to review the concluding remarks. And I revisit the remarks a lot. You'll see some important points. The fact that the scientific understanding is incomplete, that most benefits of urban trees require further investigation. These are all quotes. Another quote, in many cases, the existing base of studies is too limited to allow one to make generalizations. Some emphasize the challenges of informing decision-making in the context of the evolving science and the potential pitfalls of translating premature conclusions into practice. That's a quote. And one last quote from that conclusion, inconsistencies in existing methodological approaches and measurement methods can affect the progress of science. So there's a real unbiased cautionary note here, which also serves as a call for more research. I think we all know that more research is needed, but there's nothing better than an independent, non-biased report from the national academies in saying this. It might not be as valuable for the scientists that were in the room, but it certainly is helpful for federal agencies like the Forest Service to have a report that says that we don't know as much as we thought we did. This justifies future investment in this line of research. Final observation is that the national academies brought the top scientists together to present their work and their latest thinking. We didn't anticipate such a large and broad stakeholder audience, which represented the users of ecosystem services knowledge. So while this changed the nature of the questioning and the breakout discussions, we can celebrate the fact that the workshop brought leading scientists together with stakeholders and practitioners that are clearly interested and are very much in demand of this information. As an observer there at the workshop, it was really amazing to see the interaction between the stakeholder community and the scientist panels. This is a rare opportunity. Some people have asked the Forest Service, now what, knowing that the Forest Service was a key sponsor, and that, of course, is the next logical question. And I hope we have some time today to talk about that a little bit. A common feeling after the workshop, probably common for many workshops, is that we didn't have time to go deep. While there was value in the scientists engaging with that stakeholder audience, the scientists didn't engage directly on issues as we had hoped. We had expected a lot more back and forth on the part of the scientists. So it could leave us to think that another workshop is needed, but I'm not sure this would move us forward in a big way, and it might just lead to workshop fatigue. One idea is to move forward with what the National Academies calls a full consensus study, which is basically a really crazy thorough review of the science. The report notes that this workshop was a convening activity, not a consensus study. So what we have is a summary of the workshop and the ideas presented. A consensus study, on the other hand, would truly be a state of the science report, which would take a few years and I think hundreds of thousands of dollars. But at the end, we would have a more comprehensive report pulling from a much broader research community, more scientists, and we would have independent analysis and recommendations for moving forward. Another idea is to be much more deliberate about engaging scientists in decision-making and activities at a local level, bringing scientists together with urban land managers and decision makers in a much more direct, place-based, problem-oriented way. The best available science then informs planning and on-the-ground action in real time, and contemporary local problems help to identify the real knowledge gaps and define the science questions. So there are names for this method, like participatory research, which describes a truly interactive partnership between scientists and practitioners. I think this is where we need to go. It's a step further, I think, than what we do when we say applied research. And it begins to address some of the statements I just shared from the report's conclusion, like the challenges of informing decision-making in the context of evolving science. We would need to make sure that if we embark on that effort of these local discussions between practitioners and scientists, that we would have a national network for these activities so that we could have broad national learning and international learning and awareness of what we learn in that iterative process. So I throw this out as a possible direction. Diane actually and I have been talking about what this might look like, and a few others. So I'll end there, Jen, and pass on to Diane, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Thanks very much, Beth. Appreciate that. I will introduce Diane and give a little bit of her background while Sarah gets her lined up and gets her line open. So Diane Pataki is an associate professor, this is a long title, in the Department of Biology with the University of Utah. She also has adjunct appointments in the Department of City and Metropolitan Planning with USU Department of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning. She has her master's and her PhD was from Duke University, where she focused on forest and climate interactions, and currently her lab studies the environmental impacts of urban landscaping in Salt Lake City, Utah, and Los Angeles, California. Diane was a workshop presenter and participant and has been continuing to engage in these conversations, and I know she and Beth touch base quite often, and we're very pleased to be able to have her on the phone to be able to talk more from a practitioner standpoint and to give us a unique perspective. So Diane, are you able? Can you confirm that you're on the line? Your line is open, rather.
Unmuted. Can you hear me?
I can. Great. Fantastic. So Diane, I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much. So I really appreciate this opportunity. I really echo Beth's comments, and I support both of the possible future directions that she spoke about. I have been involved in sort of full National Academy workshop, or not workshop, but review processes before, and they're extremely thorough, and they're pretty much the gold standard. They have a long public comment and peer review process, so this is a perfect topic for a report like that, if that could be done, and I would really look forward to some specific targeted workshops with stakeholders. So what I want to do now is just briefly touch on a few of the points that I discussed at the actual Academy workshop. I think I had a whole bulleted list of things during my presentation at that time that I talked about in terms of planning the next sort of generation of urban forest planning tools. And I've condensed those into a smaller number of bullet points today. So I have 4 components that I would like to see in the next generation of tools. So I want to describe what those are briefly and then touch on what that means in terms of a future research agenda. So the first one is about tools and approaches that are specific to place. And this is something that I haven't seen come out strongly in the comments so far, but my work, as you heard, has been focused on these cities in the Western United States. And so for many years now, I've been struck by the fact that a lot of the solutions and the best management practices that I see coming out of the Eastern United States are really not suitable for the West. And it kind of brings in this bigger picture about the way we deal with place in urban forestry. So in natural ecosystems, we have this very long history of detailed studies that really get at the linkages between plants and their environment in specific places. That's actually the very definition of ecology, right? It's the interactions between organisms and their environment, and we understand those things quite well in natural systems. But in urban forestry, there's been less of a concerted effort to really understand bioregionalism in in urban forests. And we know that forests are different in different places, and culturally, we also know that people are different in different places, and I'm going to touch on that more. But I would really like to see a research agenda that gets at to what extent can we generalize urban forest processes in the United States, and to what extent do we have to have different solutions and landscape designs for different places. So my work has focused on that to some extent with regard to climate appropriate landscape designs for trees in the West. And we have shown that you can have trees in the desert, actually. There are solutions to this issue of what do you do in really dry places where trees don't grow naturally. But these forests are going to look really different than the forests that we're planting in other places. The species should be different. The way we manage resources should be different. The environmental impacts are different. And that can be incorporated into place-based tools. So that's one component, I think, of sort of a future toolbox in urban forest planning. The second thing is about community values, and I touched on this in my presentation. You know, there's all this interest in trying to quantify cultural ecosystem services. And I've written about this before, that when we go out and measure urban forests, we find that the cultural ecosystem services are often the most important ecosystem services in many circumstances. People are really connected to trees. Some of those associations are positive and some are negative, but our surveys show that positive associations, they tend to outweigh the negative associations. But how do we capture that for urban forest planning? And I am not sure that trying to quantify those values as cultural ecosystem services is necessarily the most productive approach. An alternative approach is to take a lesson from participatory urban planning, which has a long history, and it uses both visioning and scenario planning as tools to incorporate community input into decision making. And so there's this long history of doing visioning and scenario planning with regard to the built environment. Lots of community participation in different localities with regard to planning urban form, the road system, the density of buildings, and so forth. And we've seen less of that in green space planning and urban forestry, but there's no reason why we really can't do that, why we can't have a community process, a charrette process to bring people in and let people respond to different scenarios for urban forests. You know, people have very strong associations with urban trees, and if we can show them different scenarios, and this has a visualization component as well, so we have to find different ways, I think, of conceptualizing and formalizing these visions so that people can see them. But if we let people respond to these different scenarios, I think that we can directly incorporate community values into decision making without going down this road that I think is a slippery slope of having to put monetary values on cultural services. I think that's unlikely to adequately represent the connection that people have to forests. So that's the second component. The third component in this toolbox is to link the built with the non-built environment. And so just to follow on from this scenario planning process, one of the limitations that I see right now is that we've got a lot of great tools in urban planning that focus on the built environment. They focus on land use and transportation. And then we've got a lot of tools that focus on urban forests or other aspects of green space. And these things are connected to each other, and the planning process has to be linked. So there are a lot of different ways to do this, and I've spoken with Beth in the past about the possibility of including trees and green space in formal land use and transportation tools, but that's just one possibility. I also think that we should consider the role of green space and forests more explicitly in studies of urban metabolism and life cycle assessment. So there's a really active movement right now to quantify urban metabolism. That is the resource use of cities. Where do resources come from? What happens to them as they're converted into pollutants, and where do they go? That's a very detailed data gathering process that a lot of cities are conducting, and it's really important as a metric for sustainability to do these studies. But we don't actually know how green space impacts urban metabolism, because we seldom consider the impacts of urban forest at that scale, at that large municipal scale. And you know, for many ecosystem services, that's the scale that we care about. We want urban forests to impact pollution for the city as a whole, in terms of stormwater, in terms of air quality, in terms of carbon sequestration, and we have to be able to compare or study the impacts of urban forests on the functioning of the city. And so that requires bringing green space into this bigger context, the context of the function of the city and the context of the built environment. And I would love to see tools that allow us to compare different options. You know, sometimes we should be comparing green roofs with white roofs, but that's seldom done because the people that study white roofs and the tools for doing that are really different than the people that study green roofs. But really, you know, we should have some way of linking these things. And the same is true for life cycle assessment, which is a fantastic tool now being applied to cities to look at the full cradle to grave impacts of things like the embedded energy in the roads and in buildings, the embedded energy in building a car. You know, people haven't done this for landscapes and for trees, but you can. And there's been a little bit of work on this in the literature, but I think that we can do this in a more concerted way. And then the last thing that I talked about at the workshop, I think is something that people have touched on before, and that is the fact that any of these tools for planning forests need to be linked to measurable performance-based metrics. So we need to know what our goals are for urban forests, and we need to be able to go out and measure and monitor them. And when I work with architects, they like to use the phrase performance-based design with regard to buildings. And so we can use the phrase performance-based design with regard to trees. So what we need to close the cycle of designing and monitoring landscapes and make the link between science and planning and design. We need to make that link quicker when these things need to be more coupled. And so I think that we can come up with metrics at the site scale. So if we're planning a project on an individual site, we have the tools now and methodology and the technology to measure the environmental impacts and the social impacts to a large extent of that design. And at larger scales, neighborhood scales and municipal scales, we also increasingly have the tools to measure the impacts of large-scale planting programs, and urban metabolism and life cycle assessment are some of those larger scale tools. And so I think that's pretty exciting that we actually know how to measure this stuff now. That's one thing that we know. And what we need to do now is implement that. And unless we implement it in a very coordinated way in different places all across the country, we're not going to learn what we need to learn. And so I really appreciate this process that you all have put together with regard to the state of the science, because I think that we should have a conversation about a national research agenda. I do think there is value in measuring things similarly in different places, comparing and contrasting places. And I also hope that in the future we'll have a conversation about a national clearinghouse for all this information, for the data. And that, I think, is really going to advance our understanding of urban forests and also the next generation of planning tools. So that's what I have to say, and I can turn it back to Jen.
Great. Thank you, Diane. A lot of valuable information there that we need to further explore. And let me turn over quickly to Gary. And Gary Allen is the director for the Center of Chesapeake Communities. He's headquartered out of Annapolis, Maryland. And the Center for Chesapeake Communities assists local governments in their land management and watershed activities and provides financial and technical support for environmental protection and restoration efforts. And Gary wears many hats, and he's been an unrelenting champion for urban forestry, green infrastructure, and other related conservation issues for many, many years. And when he's not testifying on various issues, we're pulling him into academy workshops or our webinars. And Gary, I've given you just a few minutes here at the end to help us kind of wrap things up, but I have a lot of, I have some pending comments and questions from participants on the line. So as soon as I'll hand it off to you, and then I'll jump back in. So thank you.
Thank you, Jen. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
I'm going to be brief because I think the previous speakers have done an excellent job of outlining not only a summary of the work that we did in the workshop, but also in Beth and Diane's case of outlining the implications of that workshop for the future research that needs to be carried out. Perhaps one of the primary outcomes of the workshop from the standpoint of my participation was the identification that although we know a great deal about that role and value of urban forestry in our urban areas, there are a number of missing ingredients, so to speak, a lack of information, in the hands of many people, and to some extent, it's not simply the need for additional research. It is, as we identified in the context of the workshop itself, the lack of dissemination of the tools that are already available, particularly as they impact policy and program at the federal, state, and local level. And I was particularly impressed, not just with the content and detail of the presentations made at the workshop, but in trying to bring together some of the people who use that information at the Environmental Protection Agency, or in Beth's case, the Department of Agriculture and the Forest Service, or the Department of Interior, or the CDC. In every case, we might characterize from their particular standpoint the urban forest as some of the hardest working trees in the nation, because each tended to emphasize a particular set of ecological service benefits that their work seems to focus on, whether it be heat, air quality, carbon sequestration, biodiversity, or health. Each particular policymaker looked at the urban forest as having a particular benefit in that area. So the use of that information as they make policy, and ultimately how it impacts the regulations that local government, state, have to face as they look at these things. So as we encourage them to use these tools to measure what's there at the local level, to monitor how effectively it is providing those particular ecological service benefits, and ultimately how it helps us to grow the forest, so to speak, and management more effectively, and maintain and expand what we have to achieve those benefits, becomes the lasting impact of some of the research that we've talked about. I must admit, I was kind of blown away by Beth and Diane's comments. I'm sure it'll generate a lot of comment and question on behalf of those listening to the webinar today. So I'd like, Jen, to return it to you and say thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this. I really do believe in hyperfunctional landscapes. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you, Gary. Appreciate that. And if you have additional comments or questions, send them to me via the question feature or the chat feature. I am going to jump in right here and respond to two individuals who wanted to flag social science issues. And I do also just want to say from a logistics standpoint that Lori Geller was the only panelist who had slides. So please don't feel like you missed anything from Beth, Diane, or Gary. They were really speaking and responding overall, and we had decided not to do PowerPoint presentations, so just wanted to clarify that. That actually wasn't a technical glitch. I wanted to mention that we heard from one of our participants on the line, Dr. Kathy Wolf, that she was responding to a statement I believe that Lori made, and Lori, you can jump in if I don't have this correct, and Sarah, if you could unmute their lines while I'm talking, that would be great, the panelists, and Scott Mackos as well. That Lori might have made a comment about the psychosocial benefits are harder to quantify, and I think that coming from Dr. Wolf, this is as a social scientist, that's not an accurate statement as we attempt to meet urban challenges. She shares that she's working on a wide-ranging literature review concerning urban greening associated with human health and wellness that reveals a substantial body of science about mental health, social cohesion, resilience, etc. Those of you who are not familiar with it, please go see Google Green Cities, Good Health, and you will be able to see the nearly 40 years of high-quality science that is available and is out there. So I just wanted to flag that. And also I think too, I heard from Philip Broadbelt, the Forest Service, and he had indicated that there was a recognition at the workshop itself that there was probably somewhat of a lack of conversation or time to explore the social dimension of ecosystem services research, and that was potentially underrepresented. So I would hope someone on our panel might be able to want to respond to that.
Well, this is Lori. You can hear me. Yeah, I'm
yes.
Just want to say I'm glad Kathy raised that point, because yeah, I certainly did not mean to imply that there was a lack of quality research in this arena. I think I certainly learned a lot as we were planning for this event, how much work that is done looking at the social and the community-based metrics. I think, it is perhaps a different type of research than we're used to pursuing, and for those of us who kind of focus on the biophysical type aspects. So, it may be in part just, a lack of good dialogue that, we need to overcome through these sorts of gatherings that help us better appreciate, the work that's being done in the social sciences arena. And we'd certainly like to see more of that and like to support it. We didn't make that too much of an explicit focus for this workshop, in part just because we were trying to kind of keep a somewhat manageable set of issues to cover in the short period of time that we did. But yeah, I appreciate the emphasis that she brings up there.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Scott, are you on the line? Are you able to respond, able to ask a question or make a comment? And if not,
hi, Jen. This is Scott. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I can. I just wanted to see if you wanted to respond to anything else that was said today or flag anything in addition before I move on to a question.
I certainly appreciate the reflections on the workshop from all the panelists. I think that was a good reminder that we still have a long way to go. And I think, as everyone has been saying, we focus on this term ecosystem services, but it really goes beyond that to, the community well-being aspects and stewardship and how we involve kind of the civic side of things. It goes to urban forest assessment and how we inventory and assess the structure and condition of our forests. And it goes to the management, where we prioritize and how we do that, as I think each one of the panelists brought up. So there's a lot to it. And I also appreciate the fact that, this is really a open dialogue, and I think a lot of effort went into that. And there are some kind of concrete next steps in terms of advancing our knowledge, whether that's this next steps with a consensus study or engaging stakeholders in more focused workshops or charrettes. And, thinking kind of on behalf of my role in the tree care industry, and speaking on behalf of the tree care industry, the reality is that, ecosystem services, trees, and urban forests go beyond, just the municipal purview in our parks and public right-of-ways. And in the tree care industry, we're out there every day, speaking to people in people's backyards and working parcel to parcel, neighborhood to neighborhood. And we really see ourselves as ambassadors of this kind of science. Beth talked about, users of ecosystem services knowledge. And I think we're one, and we're out there doing it every day. And I just appreciate the place at the table that you all are giving kind of private industry in tree care.
Great. Appreciate that. Scott, thank you. I want to actually just dovetail on that. We had a comment, especially you mentioned earlier, Scott, about charrettes and doing, kind of continuing this work, but maybe on a more local level. And one of our participants said that they appreciated Diane's third point about how to measure the cultural ecosystem services. And as a person, and she goes on to say, as a person who works both in sociology and landscape architecture, she's quite skeptical of the knowledge attitude practices. I think I have that correct. I think there's a typo there. The knowledge attitude service practices that research seem to be dominant in this arena, and holding charrettes where local people can participate directly in deciding about trees seems to be a much more effective means of adding local desires to the equation, and she is going to suggest it to her local tree commission, and she's appreciative of Diane drawing that contrast. Mention that. That's it. All right. Any other comments that the panelists have on what you've heard so far? Beth, Gary, Diane, Lori. I'll give you a second to respond.
I'll make a brief comment. This is Gary, and simply say that we have been in follow-up conversations with some of the agencies I mentioned, because there is an interest in the regulatory agencies in particular in using the best science currently available. And while we do need additional tools in this area, what we found is that some of the best science currently available, widely recognized and encouraged by the science community itself, is not as encouraged by the regulatory agencies as acceptable ways to estimate and to provide credit and recognition for the ecological services benefits of the urban forest. So we want to continue and encourage that, and to the research community, I'd say help us make a better case, because ultimately I think that is a part of the rationale for support for the next set of tools that Diane talked about.
Great. Thank you, Gary. One of the other questions I've received too, I don't know that we really have time to answer it fairly, but is, and this follows along with what we're saying, that might be what's already inherent in people's minds, is asking what are the next steps in terms of tracking and disseminating information from ongoing research related to ecosystem services provided by urban forest and green infrastructure, and how do coalition members and others engage with universities, research, and public agencies to help set the agenda for future urban forestry research? That's a big question with only a 2-minute window to answer, but I don't know if Diane or Beth, you have a particular response to that.
Well, that is a big question.
It is.
I mean, I do think that the two avenues that Beth suggested, one, to produce a very extensive consensus state of the science kind of document, similar to the U.S. National Climate Assessment that was recently produced. I think that would be a go along stakeholders, and then I do think that very focused conversations between scientists and very specific stakeholders are needed so that we know exactly what people need.
Right. Thank you.
And I'll just, this is Laurie, since it is such a rapidly, evolving science and dispersed among many different disciplines, I mean, it would, of course, an NAS type study is one venue, but I think one that can be done a lot more easily and more frequently is just a periodic, kind of review of the literature review paper that's published in an appropriate journal. So, if we could identify some of, heroic members of the research community who might be willing to, every year or every other year undertake that kind of state of the science literature review and find the appropriate venue for publishing that, that could really do a great service to the research community.
That's a good practical suggestion too, of a short-term goal. And I will just flag too that, and we're right at 2 o'clock, but the working group is under the research working group under the Sustainable Urban Forest Coalition, which Scott Macco, who was on earlier, chairs. Many of you on the phone are on that group or have links to that particular group is wrestling with these questions as well, is what do we look at for short, medium, and long-term goals for our work and research, et cetera. So we have found the workshop and the report and these debriefings extremely helpful to kind of feed our conversations and process. All right, well, that is it. We're right at 2 o'clock. I want to thank all of our panelists, Laurie, Beth, Diane, and Gary, very much for participating, and thank you again, Sarah, for making this happen. It's a lot of prelim work, and we appreciate it. And thank you all for tuning in, the participants. This has been recorded, and it will be uploaded both to either or the AC Trees website and the SUFC website, and that information will come out via links. So thank you for giving us an hour of your time this afternoon, or if you're from the West Coast this morning, we greatly appreciate it and look forward to hearing from you. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye.